I don't know if my preference would be if I was in a relationship to be non-monogamous, but I do think I've realized, back to our earlier point, that I don't know that that my choice is to be with somebody long term either.
I mean, this is kind of my like coming out party
Coming out
a little
party.
bit, like here I feel finally at a place
I'm
where
so
I can talk
honored.
about it like more publicly. I mean, all my
Yeah,
close friends know. Like
sure.
there's no surprise there. And I think when it comes to family, it's like they won't I don't think anyone would truly understand. And I think their biggest concern is like, well, are you getting a divorce? No? Okay, like, okay, whatever.
This is Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Hey, welcome to Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Today I'm having one of the most relatable conversations yet with Han Ren, licensed psychologist. We're having a super honest conversation about all things non-monogamy, including what it means to be ethically non-monogamous and the role this has played in both of our lives. Hello, Han. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Liz?
I am good. Thanks so much for coming to hang out with me today. I'm so excited to just chat with you about this topic of non-monogamy is where we're going to go today. Tell us though just a little bit like about the work that you do. So you and I met through a consultation group. We both are in the mental health field. We hit it off pretty quickly, personality wise, passion wise, morals, values, ethics, all of that just kind of seemed to align. So tell us a little bit, what do you do professionally? What do you specialize in? All of that.
Yeah, so I'm a licensed psychologist in Austin, Texas. I have a group practice here, and I specialize in healing racial trauma, racial identity development, anxiety, perfectionism, overthinking, overachievers. And I really work from kind of a liberation psychology standpoint, like decolonizing mental health, where we talk a lot about systemic oppression and all of the systems of power that we live under and how they impact individual mental health.
Yeah, and that is really where you and I connected in a lot of ways. Like not even I would say intentionally, like I think it was just kind of happened. And that's where I think this topic comes in, the non-monogamy topic, because when we're talking about the societal influences and also the way that we're shamed for sexuality or our choices around sexuality,
Mhm.
that certainly all ties under this umbrella of whatever this bigger agenda is that's going on, that that we should comply with these societal norms.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like it was not something that we were ever allowed to interrogate or question. It's just, growing up such a given, such a standard.
Right, which is so interesting because then I think about like yes, the way that we think about sexuality, the way that we think about relationships, about marriage, and really you and I can relate in the terms of the research that we've done around the idea of not being monogamous and what that means. And so I was married for 18 years, got married when I was 18, and we really grew up together. And in that, there was a season of time where I started to do a lot of research around, because I sort of have these thoughts of like, what's wrong with me? Like,
Mhm.
why can't, so, and I grew up a very religious upbringing. And then my ex husband and I were actively involved in the church around that time. And it was like, why is everyone so happy in their marriages and like fine being committed? And exactly. And he was too. And I'm like, what's wrong
Mhm.
with me that I'm not content? And that's what kind of led to my research around that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, similarly, I met my husband when I was 23.
Mm.
And, before that, like I was in a very, just like a kind of a trauma vortex when it comes to relationships. And I really viewed every single relationship I had as my future ex. And, there was a lot of shame around that. And as we grew up together and grew our life together, it was like, well, maybe this will go away if I do this, or I need to like have kids and reach this milestone and have this accomplishment. And it was always like, it's because I'm not satisfied in this other realm. And so much shame around, there's something wrong with me that this is so hard.
Right. And that's interesting that you say that about the relationships that you had prior leading up to that, because I can completely relate to that. Like, I would not commit in high school, like at all. And then I remember so clearly, I talk about this story all the time. I had a conversation with my mom. I was probably like 16 or 17. Like, I have the visual. We're driving in the car and I say to her, like, do you think I'm actually going to be able to find somebody? Like, how do you know I'm going, and she,
Mhm.
again, they raised us so heavy in religion that it was like, of course, you're going to find your partner and you're going to have kids and, all of those things. And for me to have the thought as a teenager of like, but am I? Like, am
Mhm.
I going to be able to find that? And then as you're describing, getting married and then going into this cycle of like, wait, maybe I was onto something at 16 or 17 years old because something's
Yeah.
off here.
And I mean, it's like non-monogamy is something that people talk about in different ways. It's even stigmatized within like kind of alternative relationship, lifestyle norms too, because it's like not queer, it's maybe adjacent, right? But you know, people talk about it so much like, oh, it's a lifestyle that you choose. But then like for
Yeah.
some people, like it's an identity. And it's an identity that you grow into and learn to accept and become more comfortable with. And I have always felt that for me, it was more of an identity than a lifestyle choice.
Mm. Can you elaborate? Like, when you even talk about, so I had told a friend that I was doing this episode, and they were like, what's the difference between polyamory and non-monogamy? Like,
Mm.
when did we kind of switch? Is there a distinction
Yeah.
between the terms?
Well,
I
I mean,
understand
so
how
there's like
ignorant that sounds.
big umbrella, right, of ethical non-monogamy. Well, it's just like non-monogamy, there's ethical and then not ethical, which is cheating.
Sure.
But then under the umbrella of ethical non-monogamy, there's like a whole continuum. Like there's people who are just like, it's only about the sex, or it's only about, certain types of, emotional connections. But generally it's more like people who are considered themselves like non-monogamous generally are having sex with people. And then there's all the way to like polyamory, which is like multiple committed love relationships, and then like
Mm.
relationship anarchy, where there's no even hierarchy, where like every single committed relationship is a equal standing, or like you get to determine the terms of it between the two people or more than two people, whoever's in that relationship, rather than like, there's a default hierarchy that you defer to.
Got it. Okay, so we're using this term as like an umbrella statement
Mhm.
for not living this traditional Christian valued legal marriage type
Right. Right. Where I mean,
ideal.
the romantic and sexual exclusivity is
Okay.
what I think of
Okay.
as monogamy.
Sure, sure. So, how did you have this conversation? So, I know you shared with me that this is like something you've been exploring recently with your
Mhm.
partner.
Yeah.
How did it come up in conversation? Like, how did you even broach the topic?
I mean, it's been the entire time that we were together, and I think, I I do see it so much as like part of who I am, but I also see it as like kind of result of, early childhood experiences I've had, where I've had a lot of pretty disruptive attachment trauma in my early childhood, where I had such just like chronic pervasive shame about who I was and whether I was lovable. And it, grew from there to a point where I didn't know, like, could any one person love me? Could I love one person? Or do I need more than one person to love me so I could feel safe? And so when me and my partner first started dating, like, I was in a lot of just like relational trauma stuff where I was not the best to him, and I would end up like, we'd be out with friends and I'd be talking to some random people, and like, so it was traumatic for him. Like it was really, really hurtful. And then, I thought, okay, well, I just need that commitment. Like, let's get engaged, let's get settled, let's get married. And like, with every element to it, realizing, okay, some things make it a little bit better, easier to navigate, but like there's still something else that's there. And in
Mm,
tandem of exploring what do I want from this life and like really healing my own, childhood individual trauma, realizing that, that helps, but it just sort of shaped the different flavors of it. And so it was
Okay.
just revisited so many times. Like, I had my first child and I was like, okay, now I'm going to be that like committed monogamous wife, mom. And then like I
Yep.
felt like super frumpy. I wasn't myself. I had a lot of like spark that disappeared. And ironically, it was 2011 and Tinder had just come onto the field. And my partner's like, oh, there's this new app. Like maybe it can give you an ego boost. You should try it out. See what happens. And then I tried it. I was like, oh my god, I love this. And it was before like all the reputation, like what dating is now.
Sure,
Um,
sure, sure.
but like that was like, oh, okay. There's a part of me that's like still very deep in there. And then it was very triggering for him because he was like, I didn't know that I was gonna like do that. So then we like put a pause on it for a while and like, but it was like throughout our entire marriage, it has come up in different ways
Yeah.
that really made it hard to ignore. And when it became clear, like, okay, we're done having kids, we are settled in our careers, settled in our lives, and like we're fully, fully committed to each other and this life that we've built. And I'm still like yearning for something else or feeling like there's not completion for me individually. It was about 3 years ago that I was really like, we need to look at this and go to couples therapy and both be in individual therapy. And from there, we just like, kept it a topic of conversation and, ongoing work around it to the point where like now we're like pretty comfortable with being polyamorous.
So then so the doors have been opened. So that is like research phase is over. We are now implementation. Like, let's give it a whirl.
Yeah, yeah.
How is
I
it?
mean, like I've been whirling in this space for a while. And with
Fair.
like different boundaries, different types of relationships, a lot of different kinds of communication things. But like for him, it's like he's like, okay, I'm doing this now too, right? And like it's a little bit
Oh,
different for him, but he's here too. So we're both just kind of exploring to see where we land, and we're still going to all of our therapy around it, and we're
right.
still doing a lot of check-ins and touch points around it.
How did that feel for you then so that was a bit of a shift in the dynamic then, right? Like, because it was mostly you pursuing it, but now he's like, okay, well,
Yeah.
that seems fair for both of us. So what was that like for you?
Oh gosh, it was so liberating. Like it's I've been talking about this with my friends. Like sometimes when you have this expectation or this hope and you like want this thing so badly and then you get it and you're like, "Oh man, it's like disappointing." Like things
Mhm.
rarely ever live up to their expectations. But for me,
Yeah.
like with this thing, it's been so wonderful. It's surpassed my expectations. I've had
Mm.
such joy around it. And like I think maybe I'm just more of a naturally kind of compulsive person where like I see like his discovery phase and I get like really excited and like I'm rooting him on rather than like feeling jealousy. um
Okay.
and I'm sure there will be bumps and jealousy in the mix because it's just a human thing no matter
Right.
who you are. But for the most part it has felt really wonderful.
When you came like decided on the boundaries, because I'm just even like as you're talking, I'm thinking about my dynamic with my ex-husband. We're still best friends. So we are, we spend multiple times a week together, and so we actively talk about our dating lives
Yeah.
to each other, and people are like, you guys are so weird. But that's what I'm kind of like picturing, is that it's probably a similar concept of that, is
Mhm.
that we don't feel like it's weird because we have the foundation of our relationship is just there's safety in it, right? So when we're talking about it, like it doesn't feel weird. It just feels like talking to a friend. But what I have noticed for myself, so I'm interested if you've experienced this at all.
Mhm.
So even at divorced, when he's talking about maybe like his sexual relationship with somebody or starting to date somebody, like I don't like I'm like, sending my emails off or whatever. I'm not even paying attention. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. But when it comes to like him showing up emotionally, or when maybe he's not able to meet one of my emotional needs as friends, like that's very clear boundaries around just being friends, but because maybe of someone he's dating or something like that, so he's not available to me, like I notice even now, divorced 3 years later, that I'm kind of like, but hey, wait a minute, you know, like I needed something.
Mhm.
Do you notice at all, whether it's sexually or physically, emotionally, is there anything for you when it comes to all of that that
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
maybe,
we've definitely had some hiccups where we're, like, needing to align, and
yeah.
recalibrate and just bring new information and, like, desires and whatever into the fold, and, I think in our opening process, it's really been very non-traditional in that, the biggest, like, sticking point for him was sex. It was not emotions. Like, he was
Mm,
really okay with me having deep emotional connections with other people, and I think part of it is just because he knows I do that for a living, like, I'm
yeah.
forming like strong emotional connections with everybody, and I'm also just a pretty extroverted person with like deep meaningful friendships that I very much like value and prioritize. So like the emotional part wasn't hard for him, and then also like he has always had like very close work wives that like have been,
Mm,
I think other people would be like about, which I've always very much encouraged. And so like it's been kind of, not a traditional path in that like we have very allowed each other and like, celebrated the deep emotional relationships that we've formed outside of our marriage. And only more recently is like sex, been on the table. And then
mhm,
there's still some boundaries around information that we share with each other because neither of us really want to know details. And we, certainly
sure.
have conversations around safety and expectations, but um that's we agreed to not share certain things, or we say like, is it okay, do you want to know this? And then if they say
Mm,
no, like we respect that, we communicate around how much information the other person wants to receive. And I think the last part of it is like we have two fairly young-ish children, and like when you have kids, there's a inherent hierarchy, like there just has to be, because you have to
yeah.
prioritize your children's well-being and the family life, right? And so we're approaching this with like a very clear like, we put each other first. Like we are the
Sure.
hierarchy and everything else is secondary. And that's communicated with all of our other partners. And everyone is, in consent and in the know about it.
And I think, like, most often in our culture, if somebody were to have a desire to be with somebody else, the decision would have just been, then we should get divorced. Then we just shouldn't be together. What influenced your guys' decision to be like, no, that's not like, we want to be together. We want to be a
Mhm.
family and we want this. How did you come there?
I mean, I think it's because it's just been a part of the fabric of our relationship from the very beginning of just
Sure.
like, we were committed, but then it's like, oh, I mean, we always call her Hot Han, like, oh, there's Hot Han coming out, like Hot Han will forget, her partner. And it's always been kind of like this alter ego that we were like I was trying so hard to just like suppress or keep in check and like, not give her that space. But like, and I was able to do that, especially when I was like pregnant and nursing, where I was just like very much nesting mode. But it
Mm-hmm.
kind of like dimmed my lights of just
Mm-hmm.
how I approached the world and people and relationships in general. And so, over the years, it became very clear that this is a part of me that's just like baked into a part of me. And we did have that like real big reckoning, was about a year ago, where I was like, I want to like fully go there, or like we need to examine other possibilities.
Mm.
And we like had just several months of like intense like tears and like long discussions of like, is divorce on the table? Is this something that we are going to like, what's the crossroads here? And we really looked at it and we're like, neither of us wanted to dissolve our family. Like we are such great life partners, and we're such like great romantic partners too. It wasn't born from a lack in our marriage. There was no like problems. It was
Mm-hmm.
always just something that like I have wanted in addition. So, so for me, like it is an identity, but for him, it's like a lifestyle. Like he would be perfectly happy being monogamous. And he's also like, well, we're doing this now. And, I'm actually really surprised. Like he's been more into it than I thought he would be. Like,
You're like, whoa, whoa, buddy,
I know.
slow
I'm
it
like,
down.
okay, Mr. Worldwide over here. All right. But like I'm also really, really delighted that he's like having
Yeah.
fun, and it's like healing some of his early relationship trauma too, where he had some ideas about his like desirability, his sexual capital, and he's getting to like rewrite some of those scripts. And like, have some healing there. And I'm so excited about that for both of us.
Yeah, I like how you're talking about it from the lens of it being more of a healing journey versus it being the result of it stemming from trauma, because I think that's one of the most common misconceptions, and that's something I dealt with. I was open with you right when we met about, like, I'm wildly aware of my attachment traumas. I'm wildly aware of how they still come up in spite of how many years and years of work I've put in. um but that is the stigma that was with me in my marriage when I couldn't figure it out, when I couldn't be content in this one relationship, this one romantic relationship. And that was what kept coming up, is that, yeah, I just must be so severely traumatized
Mhm.
that that's why I can't stay committed.
Mhm.
How do you kind of, like, just in the research you've done and your exploration around that, what is your view on that when it comes to the stigma of, that people are going to say you're choosing this lifestyle because of your trauma or because of your attachment wounds? What are
Mhm.
your thoughts around
Mhm.
that?
I mean, it's got some validity to it, right? Like, but I also would say that, like, my childhood experiences have colored every single facet of my identity and personality. Like,
Yeah,
you can't extricate those things. And so, you can't go back and change that. Like, if I didn't have those experiences, would I be here? Like, maybe not. But
sure.
also, like, I don't think, we need to attach that shame to it. And, like, not to say that every non-monogamous person is traumatized. There's plenty who are not. But
Yeah.
yes, just like, the BDSM kink world, there's a lot of people who get to that place as a reaction and as a way to find healing and, an outlet for some of their traumas. And you just sort of, like, integrate it and roll with it. And I don't think of it as like a damaged thing, but as like a colored thing. Like,
Mm.
yes, it colors the way that I am in relationships, and that's not inherently a bad thing. It's just giving myself the opportunity to look beyond that as, like, I will forever be missing that. I can integrate something else that maybe is non-traditional and, like, find joy and healing with a different journey. And, it's
Yeah.
also very much challenges, like, our capitalistic, norms when it comes to relationships, that, like, being non-monogamous is also a political identity for me. Like, I
Mhm.
don't want to be, beholden to these structural norms.
Yeah, and that was, one of the foundations when we look into the union of marriage and we talk about that from the agriculture perspective, and that it was so much more about a financial gain or a trade than it really was about, this is how we are wired and this is how we're designed. And I think that that's what I continue to come back to. And I don't know if my personal preference, like, as a single person, whatever I so choose, but I don't know if my preference would be, if I was in a relationship, to be non-monogamous. But I do think I've realized, back to our earlier point, that I don't know that that my choice is to be with somebody long term either. Like,
Mhm.
I think that that's where my non-monogamy comes in. That's how mine kind of plays out, is that giving myself space and grace to be okay with,
Change your
I
mind. Yeah, and to,
yeah,
like, have relationships be so deep and rich and meaningful and not have to last forever or look
yes.
a certain way, or, like, to just form different ways of collective and community care in, like, taking care of each other in lots of different ways, and not having, the relationship escalator or external values determine how we want to care and love.
Yeah. Yeah. And I completely agree, because the shame that I carried of, like,
Yes.
the thought of being with somebody for the rest, like, holy shit, that's a long time, the rest of your life. That's a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you're exploring, though, from the lens that the way that you and your partner are choosing to do it, I think that there's value in that, because then you're not holding on to that really long time. Maybe doesn't, you have these other things coming and going.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like in this journey, it has really solidified our commitment to each other. Like, I feel so much more, like, sure of this because he is also sure of me, right? Like he's like willing to do something that he may not have chosen because he loves me and is so committed to me and my wellness and our life that we've built together. And so I think in a lot of ways it has deepened our relationship with each other. And I find
Yeah.
so much joy in that.
Right. Yeah. And that I was thinking the same thing when you were talking earlier, that it does say a lot, right, about how committed he is to you, about how much he loves you, that he's like, this is not my preference. This is not what I would choose, but I'm willing to do it for you.
Yeah.
How have you dealt with like the shame? Have you told family members? Have you told, like, how are you navigating all of that?
I mean, this is kind of my like coming out party
Coming out
a little
party.
bit, you know? Like here I feel finally at a place
I'm
where
so
I can talk
honored.
about it like more publicly. I mean, all my
Yeah.
close friends know. Like
Sure.
there's no surprise there. And I think when it comes to family, it's like they won't I don't think anyone would truly understand. And I think their biggest concern is like, well, are you getting a divorce? No? Okay. Like, okay, what, whatever. I don't think they I think it'd be very confusing to them. I think like, yeah, we gotta navigate like telling kids. But they also
Mhm.
grew up like in such an inclusive environment where we talk about everything that
Right.
this wouldn't be that, big of a stretch. Think like one of the things that I have some fear about is like, okay, my like friends who are the parents of my kids' friends, like that's a whole
Mm.
layer of like social circle that this doesn't naturally come up in conversation that like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's still some work to be done. Or, even with like my clients, right? This is not a part of my identity that I have been very open with. But here we are.
Here we are. And I am honored to be part of that conversation with you. I think that's a really interesting point when it comes to even your kids' friends' parents. Um, the polyamory gets almost categorized as sexual deviance, so to
Yeah.
speak. Like it gets categorized as, again, like almost a moral, it not
Mhm.
almost, I think it does get stigmatized as that way, as a moral issue. That's a really great point. Does that create fear for you
Yeah,
when
I mean,
that does
totally.
start?
There's anxiety around it, but also like,
Yeah.
we have very firm boundaries of like how we navigate this and what we protect our children and family from and like what we keep separate. And it really doesn't have to have any really influence on how we do family life. So,
Right.
and also in terms of just like our solidity as parents, like I have no, questions about like our ability to be good parents regardless of what we're doing. And I think in a lot of ways, like it's so much better than what people are doing other places, right? Where they're just like cheating on
Mhm.
each other and like hiding it and, being super secretive and still doing it and like not taking care of their hearts or each other's hearts or,
Yeah.
safety, physical safety.
It's such a beautiful point because you're right. The percentage of people who engage in non-monogamy, right, is far beyond. I tell clients that all the time. It comes up in conversation when either they're coming in because they or their partner, there's been infidelity, and it breaks my heart every time that people think they're so alone in it, because it does feel so isolating. It does. I mean, it's such a betrayal, so devastating. But feeling the humiliation around that, of like, that it happened to them for a reason, there must be something wrong with them.
Yes.
How do you navigate that world with your clients when you're dealing with the infidelity, like around that? And then, I mean, such an important comparison that it's it's not the same as being obviously open
Right,
with your
right,
partner.
right, right. I mean, I think, for a lot of us, like that was the path before, right? Where you're just like, I really struggle. Like, I personally have really struggled with monogamy.
Yeah.
And there's been such this like deep chronic shame around what that means about me as a person, as a partner, as, do I even deserve to be someone's therapist if I'm like struggling with this? And,
Yeah.
the ways that like I think about it as like in a generational term too, right? Like if I was born 10 years earlier, like I don't think I'd be here. I think I would just continue to like be very secretive and,
Mhm.
shutting it down and trying so hard to like stay within the confines of traditional marriage. If I was
Right.
born 10 years later, I think I would have arrived here way earlier and, had not had to experience all of that shame.
Yeah.
And so I think our times are changing in such a liberating way where this can be a conversation and it's so much more normalized. Like if you go on the dating apps, like so many more people are putting like ENM or poly and partnered, whatever, on their dating
Right.
profiles, especially since COVID, when people are like examining, okay, I'm spending all my time with this person. Is this what I really want for myself? Is this the life that I want to create? And how do I expand in ways that feel rich and fulfilling without blowing everything up?
Hmm.
And I remind my clients like, you know what? Like there's two different things, right? There's the betrayal and like everything that needs to happen with like trust, and reestablishing and healing and repairing from that. But then there's also
Hmm.
like there's more than, break up or never do this again, right? Like there's
Ah,
lots of different ways that relationships can look now. And
yeah.
you don't have to be so confined to what you think, the choices are.
Yeah, such a good point. Like, so important finding the gray in between. It doesn't have to be that all or nothing. And even this idea that when infidelity takes place, that doesn't have to be the deal breaker of a relationship. That doesn't have to be the end. Like, there can be exploration, there can be healing. And then, like you're saying, there could be a pivot if that's appropriate. But there are so many other options available. I love how you said, well, I don't love it for you, and I'm sorry that you experienced this, but let me validate it for you. How you're being so honest with what does this mean for me as a therapist? Because I have gone through that so much, and I have been so, transparent with my ex about that. He knows it's one of my biggest fears. That was a big reason, even for this podcast, was that I was like, I can't keep showing up as this thing that everyone wants me to be because that's not who I am. And it feels really inauthentic to me. It feels really trapping to me. But that's something I've talked to him about before is like, what does that mean for me as a therapist that I've struggled with monogamy and I have struggled with making decisions that people come in and seek therapy for, that they're like, what's wrong with me? That's so validating to hear you say that as well, that even as therapists, we are so human.
We're so human. And I think that's like, part of like the liberation psychology journey, the decolonizing journey is that like, part of this is flattening that hierarchy where like it's the expert blank slate model of like, oh, I'm just
Mm,
here like, with my pen and paper, like making observations and, completely detached from just humanity. And part of
right.
it's like, sure, you got to have boundaries and be like judicious in your self disclosure, but there's also like a lot of just connection around being able to say like, hey, I've experienced that too. And like, this is all just part of my process because I have been able to be more frank about like my lived experiences as a woman of color growing up as an Asian American immigrant and all of these different factors that have very much colored my worldview and how I approach the work of therapy. And this is just another layer of like how my identities do impact how I show up in the therapy room.
Yeah, I think social media has, been really valuable. There's a lot to be said about social media, but I do think that that's where it brings in a lot of value is that relatability piece and that normalizing piece. And I know for me that's made a really big difference in every so often, that a post will be really, I'll provide transparency of like, I see you and I hear you and I feel you in a way that you don't even realize because you come in thinking I have it all figured out. But let me assure you that is not the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we ever have it all figured out? Like we are
I
always
mean,
on
right.
professional journeys. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yes, and always pivoting. And that's, I think, what this season of your life is really representative of is this decision to do something, to finally really own what you've known
Mhm.
and pivot accordingly, which is, as you know, incredibly brave and hopefully can be even through this conversation or as you start to become more open about it, that people can really see it as more okay, more normalized.
Yeah.
Do you plan to share it more, to be more open? Like,
I think
what is your plan from
so,
here?
like, I don't think I'm going to change, like, the sort of the focus of my social media platform to this, but,
Right.
like, it's just part of it, just like all these other parts of, who I am show up on social media and what I share with the world. And I mean, I think it's also just like, like this kind of like a culmination of like, oh, now like we are here, we're doing this thing. But
Right.
like the seeds of it, I think have really been planted for the past 10 years. We've been like
Mm.
deconstructing and interrogating and iterating. Like, before this, it was like, special friends. And before that, it was like, oh, you can have like a pen pal. Or, there's just all of these different iterations that we have had trying to like scratch this itch or like meet this need, under the like guise or, comfort levels of where we were at the time. And
Yeah.
so it's just here we are at like this chapter, right? Like who knows what's going to evolve into and, what's going to happen next, but it's all been a process.
From your expertise in the field of how culture really does influence our decisions in general, and all that comes along with that, have you found that there are cultural influences, even maybe for certain cultures that, or certain populations, that maybe can own this in a different way than other populations? I'm sure you've done research around
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I think it's really hard because on the one hand, there is like, existing in a marginalized body, like there's so much that tends to like stack up and come with it, but
Mhm.
there's all of this stigma.
Yeah.
Um, but when you kind of look in like the apps of like who's swiping on here, who's doing this, like it tends to be very white. And like maybe part of it's just like where I live and
Sure.
I Austin's a white town. But it's but it's I mean, it is. It's hard to find more like people of color who are doing this. And there is a additional layers of stigma to the point where like, I don't really have any hopes that our families would really get it or like celebrate it or like be along for the ride with us. I think
Mhm.
it's um we're doing it for us in our way, but it's
Right.
like an extra layer of like deconstruction to have to, it's hard enough to talk about mental health and as an Asian person because it's already so stigmatized. Now we got this
Yeah.
like thing that is even more taboo that we are bringing into the fold.
Adding on top of it, do you think it's tied into the, I mean, this again sounds like a very ignorant question, but I would like to hear from your perspective, the white entitlement that, when we're thinking about people of color, that they have all of these additional things, that stressors that navigating day in and day out, that a lot of white people are not. And so
Yeah.
it's almost this additional freedom to be able to do this.
Mhm.
So when you're saying on the apps that there are a lot more white people, like, what do you kind of attribute that to?
Yeah, I mean, because it's a privilege, right? It's a privilege to be authentic. It's a privilege to not have to worry about, estrangement or rejection or to get fired from your job or, all of these other factors that like not only is it, being non-monogamous, but like if you are in the queer community at all, like it's
Mm,
very hard to come out as a queer person of color because of the additional stressors of just
mm,
existing in an already marginalized body. And then you have the double, triple, quadruple layers on top of it. Like it
yeah.
is more pressure, more expectations and more fear. And I do wonder about like the next generation where there's a more celebration and more inclusivity, like if it's going to be, the same type of pressure. I'm sure there's going to be different pressures, but it might
Sure.
just look a little bit different.
How do you help your clients to kind of navigate that? Your clients of color who are, maybe dealing, as you're saying, with this additional um, marginalization. How do you help them to process through that, or even come to terms with it? Like, I don't even think that's the right way to manage it, I guess. How do you, yeah, work through it?
I mean, I think there's always this balance, right? Because you got to like dismantle capitalism, but we require capitalism to live. That's the system under which we live. So we all have to like make a paycheck. Like that's just what it
Yeah.
is. It's like holding the paradox and dialectics. And it's not that different from all the other dialectics under which we live, right? Incremental change will never be enough, but incremental change is better than no change.
Mm.
And, so I really try to, help my clients challenge the status quo and the systems under which they live. Like, is it because you suck, or is it because the standards for which success, you know, has been taught to you has never been accessible or really a fair playing ground? And really understanding like how much of this is like because of you and how much of this is because of the systems under which you live. Like, and in both cases, it's still your responsibility to cope with it. And I think that's
Yeah.
sort of the area that like people get stuck on, of like, oh, but then people are just going to like, be entitled or complicit or complacent. And, regardless of like where it came from, it's still our responsibility to live with it. So how
Mhm.
do we bring on some compassion and understanding so we can like navigate this in a way that feels, true to who we are, and yet also acknowledging the barriers that very much exist.
Yeah, so important, so empowering when you can look at it from both perspectives, that there are these barriers, there are these things in the way, and there are things within our circle of control to do something about that, to manage it, how we respond to it. And what a difference that makes when we can hold both truths simultaneously. um that we do have more power maybe than we realize in a lot of situations, and there's a lot of really shitty stuff that we're powerless to.
Yeah, for
Finding
sure.
that gray.
But it's like we're all just trying to survive. And I think that's one of the, silver linings, I guess, of this pandemic, where like people are trying less hard to survive based on someone else's standards for them. Like,
Mm,
just realizing with this collective trauma, this collective grief, like life is short. There's a lot of fucked up things going on in the world. And we're all just trying to like find our pockets of joy and make it make sense for us in our
yeah,
unique ways. So, like, why are we trying so hard to live up to somebody else's standards for us? And yes, that also comes with privilege, to be able to choose what makes sense for you. Both are true.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And we try to live up to those standards because we want acceptance and we have attachment issues. So
Absolutely.
that's what's going on for us. What would you say, before we wrap up,
Yeah.
people who are listening and they're like, yes, I can relate, I can resonate, it's what I want. Where even to start with that? What is the conversation to be had? What's a good way to start the conversation? Maybe just like a couple ideas on where to get started.
Yeah, I mean, start reading. There's a lot of really great books out there that are super helpful for understanding and navigating this. I mean, there's like books for therapists all about like understanding this as well. Some of my favorites are like not kind of the first wave stuff that I didn't really
Mhm.
find helpful, but like I really love Polysecure by Jessica Fern. I really love following Polyphilia blog on Instagram and TikTok. There's a book called Open Monogamy by Tammy Nelson, which like for people who maybe don't want to go all the way to the polyamory relationship anarchy side, but just want to like, stay committed, but like open up a little bit here and there. And like, there's a whole spectrum. And the more we can, you know, let that be a thing, right? Like there doesn't have to be like all or nothing. You can choose what works for you in your own relationships, and you can change your mind. Maybe you try it out and it's like, maybe that's not for me.
Right.
These are all possibilities. But I will say, like, if you're having problems in your relationship and you want this to be a fix for you, that's not going to happen. Like, this is not something that you can add thinking that you will no longer have your core relationship problems. It's just going to add more. And in fact, like when we had that really, kind of come to Jesus like interrogation of like what's going to happen in our marriage, like I stopped all dating. Like it was
Mhm.
just like we spent a good like 8 months of just intense couples work and focusing and talking and connecting, of just like, no, we got to figure this out for us. This is our, foundation and basis, and everything else is like, maybe it'll be there, maybe it won't, but we cannot move forward for either of us until we are good, the two of us, and on the same page. And like that, like core work was so fundamental to everything else. And also, like, part of that core work was revisiting early relationship trauma, which like nobody likes to do, because like we're not the same people that we were when we, got into these relationships 10, 15 years ago. But some of
Yeah.
those foundational wounds still impact the way that we interact and the way that we relate now. And so we had to really dig deep and interrogate and excavate some of those old traumas and heal from that before we were able to actually move forward in, new frontiers.
Which again is just so beautiful and so profound, and like that is what I want really to be heard, is that you are not choosing this lifestyle because you are defective and damaged. It's complete opposite, that you've done your healing, you understand who you are, your partner understands who he is, and because of that you're able to explore this lifestyle. And that is just so crucial, because it really does work to destigmatize that this decision is not coming out of a place of trauma, it's coming out of a place of your truth.
Yeah, a
And
place of
that's
healing.
powerful.
And we got to a point where we're like, okay, maybe we won't ever, open up, and that's okay. Like, because we had just done so much deep relationship excavation between the two of us, and we were both feeling so much more at ease and peace with each other that, like, it no longer was the point, even though it started the point, and then we still kind of ended back here. Like, that
Right.
just is what made everything that much more like, liberating.
Right. Yeah. The major takeaway being that there are it's so many gray areas in relationships, and you are allowed to choose what is best for you, and you are allowed to do what makes the most sense. Assuming and ensuring that you are protecting your heart in the process, you're protecting your partner's heart in the process, but you have choices, and you're not stuck within the bubble that society wants to tell us that we are. So such an empowering conversation. I really appreciate you, Han. Where can people find more about you? Where are you on social media or website?
Yeah, I'm on TikTok and Instagram as Dr. Han Ren, and my website is just drhanren.com.
Well, I really, really appreciate you being here. And I am truly honored. I know I am, like I've said it a million times, that you would come and share this story. I mean, this is what you shared today is the foundation of this podcast, that we are having real conversations about relationships, and we are making them relatable and normalizing them so people can feel less alone. And I am so grateful for you coming to share with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Liz. Such an honor.
Absolutely. So grateful for Han's transparency and vulnerability today. Thank you for hanging out with me on Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.